Hello everyone, this is Ed Runkle, pastor at Tapestry Church, seen here weekly on LCTV channel 66, and you may see us live every Sunday morning at 10:30 at 22 Crady Avenue in your... Good morning everybody, welcome to Tapestry Church. I'm so glad you're here. I hope I don't develop a reputation for potty humor in that I did the whole public defecation story not too long ago in India, but I came across another story, stumbled upon a finding that's so interesting, I just have to share it with you. Did you know that virtually all mammals, from dogs to elephants, including human beings, take the same amount of time to urinate? Who knew, right? They do. I mean, you can Google this when you get a chance after the service, but it's 21 seconds. I understand it's a matter of physics and urethra length or something like that. I don't know that these findings take into account any kind of health issues or aging prostates, but here's why I tell you. Virtually all animals, from mice to elephants, take the same amount of time to urinate. Virtually all human beings experience shame. It's just a part of human experience in this fallen world. The trouble is that sometimes we can get stuck in our shame, and it can lead to all kinds of disordered living. You know what I mean by shame? It's that little gremlin that says, you're not good enough, or you never finished your GED, or that BA, or that MBA, or your spouse left you, or, I know those things that happened to you when you were a kid, or I know you don't think you're pretty enough, or smart enough, or talented enough, or powerful enough. I know your dad never paid attention to you even when you achieved such and such, and you can just fill in the blank. That's shame talking. And candidates, for shame include, overly responsible people, moralizers, compulsive comparers, approval addicts, people who never feel deserving or kind of are stuck in the shadow of a parent or someone else, or are condemned by bad memories of things they've done, or maybe things done to them. I mean, virtually all of us are affected by shame to some degree or another. But there's some very good news for those of us who struggle with this, and it's in the story of a woman who sought healing from Jesus in a rather indirect way. And here's how the gospel writer Luke, kind of like one of Jesus' biographers, tells this story. Now when Jesus turned, this is Luke chapter 8, verses 40 through 48. Now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus, who was the ruler of the synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. As Jesus went, the people pressed around him, and there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. And Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and are pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him, and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Okay, here's a little bit of context or backstory. Jesus at this point was, kind of a reluctant celebrity, and a crowd had gathered around him as he was making his way to Jairus' home to heal the synagogue's ruler's daughter. Now, this desperate woman in the crowd was somehow aware of Jesus' healing power, that when he touched people, they were healed. And her thought was, if he could just touch me. But she had a problem. See, everyone who came to Jesus for healing had to tell him and thereby everyone else what his or her problem was. I mean, Jairus had just done that. But can you imagine, this woman explaining her, vaginal bleeding in front of all those men? Even worse, this bleeding made her unclean according to Jewish law and only deepened her embarrassment. Maybe, though, just maybe, Jesus wouldn't need to know he touched her. What if she touched him? With that mess of people all trying to get close to him, she could just quickly touch his cloak. No one would ever know. So this is what is going on. There was something in her life that she really didn't want other people to know about. And, I think we all have something like this, a stubborn weakness, a humiliating failure, or an embarrassing illness, something, from our past, some present struggle with sin, or maybe even, we're just afraid that something will get exposed and uncovered, and people will find out what we're really like, and, that's just kind of evidence of our struggle with shame. And, with that, our shame comes this fear of being exposed, of being found out. If you're trying to control your world or trying to prevent yourself from being discovered, then you're probably dealing with some unresolved shame. When we know something's wrong in our life, what do? We do just what this woman does, try to blend in with the crowd, or we do just what, fly under the radar, or we do just what, Adam and Eve do in the garden after they realized that they were naked and ashamed. They try to hide. And so, in effect, shame becomes an identity thief. It steals away who we are. Adam and Eve covered themselves with fig leaves because if people see me for who I am, they'll reject me. In our shame, we pretend. We put on a mask. There are different masks. Sometimes people put on the witch mask, and when it kind of disguises our shame, we disguise our shame by becoming very sharp or critical toward others. Or maybe we put on the Arnold Schwarzenegger mask, tough and independent, and nobody messes with me. But everywhere we go, we're wearing that mask. There's this frightened little person under there. Or maybe we, put on the clown mask and we're the joker. And so the moment you try to relate to someone who wears this mask, they're joking, and you never get past their jokes. The real person never comes out. And if the real person never comes forth, into your life, your identity, who you are, has been stolen. And, it's just one of the strategies, ineffective strategies for dealing with shame and for trying to avoid exposure. And, they don't work, these strategies. So we hide deeper and deeper, or work harder and harder at numbing ourselves. It's what you might call the everything's fine two-step, And so shame is not only an identity thief, it's an intimacy thief. Because if you've got a mask on so no one can see you, and you're afraid of exposure, and you're acting a part, that's going to affect, every relationship. And so, you can't get near anyone. I mean, you can be around a table with them, or, you can talk with them and you can share with them, but they never know you. They never can know you, and you can never be known while you've got this mask on. I mean, it's kind of like sometimes you may have noticed this in messages when I speak about, something stupid I've done or said or left undone. I'll often ask the question, am I the only one? Well, in our efforts to kind of protect ourselves from exposure, we can become isolated and feel like not only am I not okay, everyone else is fine. I'm the only one who would do something this, stupid. I'm the only one who would be this dumb. Others fail, but not like me. Others make mistakes, but not like me. Anybody else ever feel like that? Sometimes in our shame, we literally, are isolated and distanced, and we're banished from words like normal, everyone, belonging. It's as though shame revokes our access to the word us. Let me just shift focus here for a minute. Let me make a distinction. There's a lot of confusion between the difference, or about the difference between shame and guilt. They may appear similar, but they're not the same. Guilt comes from violating a rule or committing an offense. To feel guilty requires a conscience. Guilt is about what we do. It may lead to confession. It may involve in punishment. Is relieved by restitution and forgiveness. Well, sociologist Brené Brown, who's done a lot of research around shame, helpfully points out that shame is different. While guilt is about behavior, I made a mistake, shame is about self, I am a mistake. In other words, guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. And shame can't be punished because it is its own punishment. There's no restitution that can be made. Shame-prone people translate a criticism of what they do into a judgment about who they are and what they are. They hear criticism of an action and feel as if their character has been called into question. Through extensive interviews with people about vulnerability and shame, Brown has discovered that shame is highly, highly correlated with addiction and depression and violence, aggression, bullying, suicide, and eating disorders. Guilt, however, is inversely correlated to those things. Brown says the ability to hold something we've done or failed to do up against what we want to be, which is guilt, is incredibly adaptive. It's uncomfortable, but it's adaptive. Think about it like this with me, the difference between guilt and shame. If you were here the other week, I had talked about learning from the past and from a bad in my past, a little story about a motorist who appeared to gesture me in his rearview mirror. Well, I didn't learn that lesson. Literally on the Sunday after that service on my way into town, this one I didn't notice, but my wife did. Evidently, instead of slowing for someone who was going to in front of me coming from the other opposite direction, so I had the right of way, evidently, it was a passenger, sent a gesture my way. Let me just say, I experienced a sense of guilt. It was very uncomfortable, but I believe adaptive. That is, God got my attention about, my attitude or presence behind the wheel. That could easily become a source of shame. Some people go through their whole lives without being on the receiving end of a gesture, their whole driving careers without being on the receiving end of a gesture like that. I'm kind of like with the writer John Acuff on this. If God, grades on the shame system, then, I want to be up front. My house in heaven is going to be sick. There are going to be water slides everywhere, not just at the pool, but between rooms. You want to, get a Capri Sun from the kitchen, hop on the water slide. You want to work out in the gym, hop on the water slide. And my greatest source of shame, the record I like to spin the most, is called The Way Ed, Dishonors God. And it's got some jams on there, including Ed should know better, but he still makes the same mistakes. Or, Ed wrestles with the simplest elements of faith and will never be a good enough Christian. And it's on and on from there. I admit, I live a pretty sweaty existence, but, I wonder, am I the only one? Does anybody else struggle with this stuff? Healing, freedom. It all begins in a place of vulnerability and honesty. When the woman in the text realized that she had been caught, it had never occurred to her that she might be stealing this healing. She looked up at Jesus and meekly said, "It was me." Well, he looked at her, and so did everyone else. And even as they backed away from her, I mean, she was unclean. His eyes were intense, but not angry. The tears came as she stepped toward Jesus. She dropped to her knees in front of him and said, I touched you, Master. She poured out her shame in front of everyone. And probably, every one of us in this room can recall the look of disbelief on someone's face when we shared, some kind of hidden shame or secret. And so we, doubt that others' actions toward us when we become vulnerable. They've kind of proven to be doubt-worthy. And so, we're reluctant to become vulnerable, to risk vulnerability. We opt to live disappointed rather than to feel disappointed. But Jesus was moved by this woman. He leaned toward her and wiped her tears and said with powerful gentleness, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." And see, what Jesus was exposing in that moment was not this woman's weakness and shame. He was exposing her faith. He wanted her faith visible so that everyone who carries secret shame might have hope. I mean, the Greek word for confess literally means to say the same thing. And I suppose that makes perfect sense, because the story we tell ourselves, the one that includes, the ways we rationalize and excuse or project our brokenness onto others so that we don't have to deal with it, that's one story. But then there's the reality of how it's impacting our lives and the people around us. Well, confession is about saying the same thing and allowing the story that we tell in our heads to line up with the reality of how we're actually living. I mean, this encounter we're looking at this morning is part of a larger section in the book of Luke, where the main focus seems to be that Jesus is Lord, that he has authority over everything. In the previous section, he calms a storm. He has authority over nature. In the section following, he raises Jairus' dead daughter. Jesus has authority over sickness and even death. Luke wants us to see what he wants us to see is that Jesus has the last word and the final say, that Jesus is bigger than, our shame. Vulnerability, honest confession, that shouldn't be this scary thing we do our best to avoid. But, it shouldn't be the constant elephant in the room that we won't talk about, but it should be liberating. And, it should be propelled by a deep appreciation and gratitude toward God, who's made it possible for us to no longer fear being exposed, because God is bigger than. I mean, I heard about a college student who was taking a senior course in logic, and the professor of the course was rather famous for being a tough tester. But he said before the final exam, "I'll tell you what, for your final exam, you can bring into the test anything you can put on a sheet of paper." So students crammed, and they wrote as small as they could write and put, all their notes that they could on a sheet of paper. Well, when it came to the day of the test, one student walked in, and he came in last with a black sheet of paper. He put it on the floor beside his desk, and in walked a graduate student who stood on that piece of paper. And every time the student had, a question he couldn't handle, he just leaned over and conferred with the graduate student. And because of the involvement of the graduate student, the student was able to achieve an A on that final exam. Well, in a similar way, because of what Jesus has done for us on the cross, we don't have to hide in our shame. We're free to be vulnerable, from posing as though we're perfect when in our heart of hearts we know that we're not. We're free to give up those moments of shame or embarrassment or vulnerability, those moments where you just want to die or fly away or disappear, go back in time. I think all of us have dreams about invisibility, because it feels like behind the veil of invisibility there's this incredible amount of freedom. We'd be be this perpetual avoidance of any and all human condemnation. There would be no more, up and down looks evaluating our appearance. No more conversations where we'd have to say something we regret. We could do what we want and when we want, and no one could judge us. But here's the punchline. As wonderful as invisibility would be, God offers something better. God holds out as a gift something greater than the avoidance of judgment. He offers pardon from it. In other words, he offers peaceful visibility in his finished work, in the finished work of Jesus Christ. He absolves all the things in our lives that make us want to be invisible. So if we receive that finished work of Christ by faith, the critiques of others, though they don't stop, they become irrelevant. Our desire for invisibility becomes moot because whether or not people see us, who we really are, doesn't matter. And the beautiful irony we find is that there's greater freedom than can be found in invisibility. But often there's another part of the equation when it comes to dealing with shame. And that is learning what it means in practice to be this person that God keeps telling us we are. It's like what Paul says to the Philippian church: live up to what you've already obtained. I saw an interesting article indicating that we Americans have tremendous faith in ourselves. Evidently in 1950, the Gallup organization asked high school seniors, "Are you a very important person?" Well, at that point, 12% said yes. They asked the same question in 2005, and at that time, 80% said, "Yes, I'm a very important person." Well, Time magazine asked Americans, "Are you in the top 1% of earners?" 19% of Americans indicated that they're in the top 1% of earners. I mean, those of you who know me know I don't do math very well in public, but I don't think 19% of us can be in the top 1%, right? And by the way, Americans score 25th in the world in math, but if you ask Americans, are you really good in math? We often say yes. In other words, we're number one in the world at thinking we're really good in the math, really good at math. But here's what I'm trying to get at. Our shame has a way of messing with our sense of self. It distorts our sense of self. I mean, it's like if you've ever looked someone in the eye and, kind of talk to them about how you value them and what great qualities they have in their lives, they often begin to react. And often what they're reacting to is that they can't agree with you, over what you're saying about them. Well, God has many, things to say about you. And I think in a similar way, we often react and don't believe, the things that God says about who we are. People who suffer from shame, especially undeserved shame, they could hear a choir of 500 voices sing an anthem to their good qualities and deny they ever heard a word of it. They hear honest compliments and they discount them before they sink in. They tell themselves that people aren't sincere. If they only knew the truth. Sometimes people will even hear judgment when someone intends love. It's, very common. But take a good long look in the New Testament at how Jesus treats people who are clearly dripping with shame. I mean, look at how he treats the Samaritan woman at the well. This is in John's Gospel, chapter 4. She's had a string of failed marriages, is now unmarried, but living with, some guy. Jesus knows everything about her, yet he initiates a conversation with her, singling her out for compassionate attention. And when he reveals that he knows everything, he simply continues the conversation without a single word of judgment or exhortation. And then he implicitly tells her that the gospel is for her too, and does her the great honor of revealing that he's the Messiah. Kind of like Clark Kent telling Lois Lane that he's Superman. That is, Jesus is being vulnerable with her. Jesus has made her vulnerable by outing her but then he stoops to join in her vulnerability by outing himself. A claim to be a Messiah is certainly a risky, vulnerable thing to say. I mean, try that at your next social gathering. I mean, one of my favorite things about Jesus is how he does whatever he wants to and could really give a poop about what other people, feel about it. But in his presence, people never felt shame. They felt welcomed, they felt honored, they felt joy, they felt included, they felt valued, they felt family. They heard my friend, they looked up and saw that Jesus meant them. And they would think, well, but I have blood on my hands, I'm a furious zealot, or I'm a rich and hated tax collector, or I'm an unclean woman with an issue of blood, or I'm a smelly shepherd, or a desperate prostitute, or a lonely leper, or an oppressive Roman centurion. I'm a despised Samaritan. But instead, of waiting for us to become something we can never be, God gives us that which he requires, perfection. In exchange, he takes our imperfection onto himself. And then he speaks a loving word over his righteous Son, and that word is applied to us. He calls us perfect. He calls us holy. He calls us beloved. And since God's word calls into being things which he speaks, we become what we are naturally not: perfect, holy, and beloved. Thank you for joining us at Tapestry Church this morning. We hope you enjoyed the message. For more information, you may check out our website or Facebook page, and you may see us live weekly at 22 Crady Avenue at 10:30. All are welcome.